In 1969, one of the largest search and rescue operations in U.S. national park history was undertaken. The target of the search was a 6-year-old boy who had been camping with family when he suddenly vanished. The boy was never found, and over 50 years later there are still unanswered questions. This is the case of Dennis Martin. Dennis Martin was born June 20th, 1962. He was one of 4 children to Violet and William Martin, who were residents of Knoxville, Tennessee. At 6 years old, he was 4 feet tall and 55 pounds, with dark brown eyes and curly brown hair. The Martin family described Dennis as quiet and well-behaved. He had a minor learning disability that put him about half a year behind his peers. Dennis liked being outdoors, and he spent Father's Day weekend camping and hiking almost every year. In 1969, the trip included Dennis's 9-year-old brother Doug, their father William, and their grandfather Clyde. The 4 of them were traveling around Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a large wilderness area that sits in both Tennessee and North Carolina. Dennis and his family were spending the weekend on the Tennessee side. The Martins had spent the night of June 13th at Russell Field. They woke the morning of the 14th with a plan to hike over to nearby Spence Field and set up a camp there. On the way to the field, the family met Carter Martin and his 2 sons. Carter's last name is a coincidence. He's from Alabama and has no relation to Dennis's family. The Alabama Martins got along well with Dennis and his family, and the 2 groups went forward together. Once they reached Spence Field, the children of the group ran off to play. To keep an eye on them, the adults chose an area about 40 yards from the kids to sit and talk. William Martin recalls seeing the 4 children stop what they were doing and huddle together. He knew they must be planning something. The adults watched Doug and the 2 Alabama Martin children run south, while Dennis ran northwest. Doug would later explain that the plan was for Dennis to go north and then south to meet up with the others. He claimed Dennis was only sent off on his own because he wore a red shirt, and it would have been easier for the adults to see him coming. Once reunited, the boys planned to jump out from behind the adults and playfully scare them. The plan went off without a hitch for the group of 3. They circled around without incident and jumped out from behind their parents. The adults played along with them and had fun, and then the group waited for Dennis to arrive. A minute passed, and then 2, and by minute 3, Dennis's father was starting to worry. He walked over to the bush he last saw Dennis walk behind, but didn't find anything there. William then started off on the Appalachian Trail to Little Bald. He walked about a mile before turning back, hoping Dennis had come back to the group at Spence Field. When he still wasn't there, William went in the opposite direction on the trail, reaching Russell Field about 2.5 miles away. He then returned to Spence Field again. William would later explain that because Dennis had just come from camping at Russell Field, he thought he might have gone back there. After William came back alone a second time, Clyde Martin made his way to the ranger station at Cades Cove. He had officially reported Dennis missing by about 8:30 that night. 3 rangers assisted the Martins in briefly searching the immediate area of Spence Field. They traveled parts of Boat Mountain Road, Laurel Creek Road, Ledbetter Ridge, Russell Field, and the Appalachian Trail. The few passers-by who were encountered were questioned, but none of them had any information. As night fell, a severe thunderstorm hit the park, and the search was halted. The real search would begin the next day at 5 a.m. On June 15th, the Martin family met park personnel and members of local search and rescue teams at Boat Mountain Road. More manpower was called in during the first day of the search and the coming days as it became clear the search radius would need to be expanded. Hopes were initially high that Dennis would be found quickly. Officials anticipated the boy would be located at one of the trails or drainages close to Spence Field. These places were searched carefully and repeatedly throughout the search. When Dennis wasn't located in any of the expected areas, the search was expanded to places he might have reached. This included nearby ridgetops as well as Fontana Lake to the south of Spence Field. William Martin told officials he thought Dennis could have gone to the Anthony Creek Drainage or the Eagle Creek Drainage, and further investigation was done into both areas. 2 days into the search, 2 local men found a set of child-sized footprints near a waterway that feeds into Eagle Creek. The footprints were 1 shoed foot and 1 barefoot, the shoe print matching the type of shoe Dennis had been wearing when he was last seen. The men were able to follow the prints for about 300 yards, but lost them when they trailed off into the water. Because the prints hadn't been washed away by rain, they were probably left on June 15th. Search officials refused to follow up on the footprints, reasoning that the area had already been thoroughly searched. They assumed the prints likely belonged to a different child. There were about 30 Boy Scouts camping in the park the weekend Dennis went missing. They had offered to help with the search when they heard about his disappearance, leaving child-sized footprints in the mud throughout the search area. Though it is possible the prints belonged to one of them, because there was no follow-up, there's no way to prove one way or the other. Media attention increased each day Dennis was missing. There was immense pressure being put on officials to find him, and the public were eager to help. At its maximum, the number of people assisting with the search reached 1,400. These individuals range from experienced Special Forces troops to inexperienced volunteers. A large amount of unsolicited donations were arriving as well, including an entire semi full of lettuce. Officials eventually set up a roadblock at Townsend so rangers could start to vet people before letting them into the search area. Calls began to come in from people alleging they hid ESP. The Martins believed in these leads, and any that weren't too vague had to be investigated. In some cases, callers provided directions to an area they said Dennis could be found. In others, callers described the area the boy was in. None of these calls resulted in finding Dennis or any evidence of him. A June 18th meeting resulted in searchers being diverted into North Carolina to expand the search area further, and FBI agent Jim Reich deciding to look into the Martin family. Agent Reich was on hand for most of the search in case evidence of foul play was found. If and only if it was, the FBI would launch a full investigation into Dennis's disappearance. The 20th marked Dennis's 7th birthday, and by then it was clear positive attitudes in the search for him had shifted. There were searches of animal feces and pit toilets being done. Any odors of decay reported were investigated. The 1-mile radius around Spence Field had been scoured, and map comparisons showed a completed search area of 56 3/4 square miles. 12.5 of those miles had been searched intensively. The search teams had looked up on ridge tops and down in creeks, saturating a wide area. With so much of the logical search area having been picked through repeatedly, officials decided to start back at Spence Field the morning of the 23rd and search the entire area again. On June 25th, Park Superintendent Fry issued a press release stating that if Dennis wasn't found by the 29th, the park would be greatly reducing the search. The next 4 days came and went with no news, and on the afternoon of the 29th, a meeting was held between the Martin family, Agent Reich, Chief Ranger Snedden, and other park officials. The Martin family received assurance from Chief Ranger Snedden that he would keep the limited search active for 90 more days. FBI agent Reich expressed that although there would be no FBI investigation launched, he would keep in contact with park officials to keep updated on new information. The search operation at Spence Field was officially closed at 6 p.m. that evening. As promised, a smaller search was ongoing until September of 1969. Shortly after the full search for Dennis ended, a strange report came out about a man who had an odd experience in the park the afternoon of June 14th. In July of 1969, Harold Key reported hearing an enormous, sickening scream while visiting the Rowans Creek area of Sea Branch. Harold had come to the park to see wildlife with his children and was directed to Rowans Creek by a ranger, reportedly because it was a good place to find bears. The Key family was checking out the area when Harold claims to have heard the scream. He said that when he looked in the direction of the sound, he saw an unkempt man who seemed to be trying to hide from view in the trees. At the same time, Harold's son got his attention to point out what he thought was a bear in the same location. Unaware someone had gone missing that day, Key and his family left the park without reporting the incident. It was only once Harold learned of Dennis that he contacted park officials with his information. Key was asked to meet with Agent Reich and Ranger Ed Widmer in the park to take them to the place he heard the scream. He told them he didn't know exactly what time it happened, but he was able to give a time frame. The National Park Service investigated and deemed the time frame wrong for the incident to have any connection with Dennis. Their official stance was that there was no way someone could have traveled the distance between Spence Field and Rowans Creek within the time provided. It's worth noting that this idea was tested after the incident and it was found to be wrong. According to former park ranger Dwight McCarter, it was absolutely possible for a man in good physical shape to make the hike within the provided time. The FBI also weren't interested in the scream, concluding it didn't constitute evidence of foul play and wasn't worthy of further investigation. No possible explanation was ever given for the Key incident, and it remains a bizarre occurrence and a troubling case. William Martin was in frequent contact with Knoxville FBI office after the search concluded. Among other things, he pushed for them to begin investigating Dennis's disappearance. The Martins had started to believe their son was kidnapped, and if an investigation was started, he could still be found alive. They were even offering a reward, and missing persons flyers were created and printed out to be posted in public areas. Sadly, their efforts seem to have been the result of being in a state of denial. Both the FBI and the National Park Service have said they believe the Martins started to think Dennis was kidnapped as a way of coping with the reality that he was unlikely to be alive. Regardless of the reasoning, it appears the Martins truly did believe what they were saying. William and Violet provided authorities with information leaning toward the possibility of an abduction multiple times. While the search was still ongoing, William had started to question the intentions of a man present in the park. The man allegedly had a questionable reputation and seemed to be constantly hovering around search operations, appearing overly curious. His actions were suspicious enough that even park officials took notice. It seems the man was simply getting too invested, though, as the FBI investigated his whereabouts on June 14th, and they were able to confirm he had not been in the park. In one of his calls to the FBI, William brought up two men whose motives he felt were questionable. He pointed out that the first man acted strangely and stayed in the search area for 2 weeks without ever assisting in the search. He said that man had become acquainted with another man, this one claiming to have ESP. Martin believed their actions were suspicious enough to warrant further follow-up. The first man William refers to is likely the one authorities were able to rule out. The second individual is not named in the FBI report, but the information provided indicates it could be alleged psychic interpreter Billy Nolan. Nolan is referenced in the National Park Service report, where it's noted that he'd spoken with the Martins before heading toward Rocky Top on June 25th. He had told the Martins he was sure he'd be able to find Dennis. The report states that Nolan brought no money, food, shelter, or equipment with him. It's unclear how long he was in the search area or what else he did while there. In spite of William's distrust of the man with ESP, the Martins were still interested in the information of psychics. An unknown woman who said she had such powers contacted Dennis's mother Violet during the search. The woman said there was a man who was camping at Spence Field when Dennis vanished who needed to be closely watched. The information made Violet suspect that the woman, the camper, or both of them together could have taken Dennis. According to a memo included in the FBI's files, a psychic was in contact with William around the beginning of October 1969. The woman told William she'd predicted there was a building in the area of Spence Field that had something to do with Dennis's disappearance. She described the building as a small cabin with a front porch, and in her vision she was able to see something shining in the far left corner when looking at the structure from the front. A park ranger went to Spence Field with William, where they found an old hiker shelter that seemed to match the woman's description. Inside, the shelter had multiple bunks to sleep on, and William climbed underneath the bunk in the back left corner. There he located a pair of boys' underwear with a rock on top of them. He retrieved the underwear and handed them over to the FBI. The underwear was sent for lab testing with a request that technicians attempt to determine their brand, if they had any laundry marks, the nature of any stains on them, and how long they might have been under the bunk. The lab report states that it was impossible to tell exactly how long the underwear were in the shelter. It does note they were badly deteriorated, indicating they were probably laying there for a long time. The lab measured the underwear as having a 16-inch waistband, a size fitting for an infant or small child. There were no laundry marks found on the underwear, and the brand was not apparent. The report doesn't mention staining, but does note that there wasn't any blood on them. There's no further information about the underwear, but it's likely they weren't related to Dennis in any way because of their size and condition. Dennis's case is considered puzzling to many people. The abrupt way he vanished and searchers' lack of ability to find any trace of him have led to a variety of theories created to fill in the gaps. Dennis was included in David Paulides' 2012 book Missing 411, Eastern United States. If you're unfamiliar with Paulides, here's a very brief summary. Paulides researches the cases of people who have gone missing in and around national parks in the United States. He has written multiple books about these cases where he draws links between them using mysterious details they share. Paulides believes there is something unsettling happening in the forests of these national parks. He goes as far as claiming the National Park Service knows this to be true and they are engaging in a cover-up. Paulides' work is highly controversial due to issues including his many references to Bigfoot and inconsistencies in his information that range from minor to important details. Dennis has become somewhat synonymous with the Missing 411 phenomenon. You can find his case included in a lot of videos and writing focusing on it. It's for that reason I've chosen to mention it here. I won't be going into any details or discussing Missing 411 any further than this. I always encourage people to do their own research and come to their own conclusions on anything considered strange and unusual, and I highly suggest that when it comes to this topic. Abduction is one of the first lines of thinking when a child disappears. It seems that from the beginning, park officials and the FBI never considered it a possibility in Dennis's case. However, the FBI was provided leads in that direction multiple times, and follow-up was done on those which were seen as viable. In July of 1969, the FBI received information about a man who had spoken to several people about Dennis. According to the informant, the man, who had a boy around Dennis's age with him, was in the park on June 14th, and he now seemed overly invested in Dennis's disappearance. An agent was sent to Hopkinsville, Kentucky to interview the suspect. He told the FBI that he was speaking with a few strangers in Nashville regarding Dennis. He admitted he'd been in Gatlinburg, Tennessee beginning on June 13th with his wife, son, and his wife's parents, but claimed they stayed in a hotel the entire time they were there. The boy mentioned by the informant was the man's son, and the reason he'd been so interested in Dennis was that hearing about a boy his son's age disappearing so suddenly bothered him and his wife a lot. They'd been following the case in the media, hoping Dennis would be located. The agent was able to verify the details of the man's stay in Gatlinburg, and he was cleared of any involvement. Around the time of the investigation into the Hopkinsville man, Blount County Sheriff L.B. Sutton tipped off the FBI to a man he'd been told was living in the park. This individual was camped about 7 miles from Spencefield, and he had a job in Cades Cove. When interviewed, the man told officials that he was working all day on June 14th. His alibi was corroborated by his employer. The FBI ruled the man out based on timing. It would have taken too long for him to have traveled to Spencefield, committed a kidnapping, and then returned to work without ever being noticed missing. The following November, a special investigator from Portland Public Schools in Oregon contacted the Martin family directly. He believed Dennis could be a boy attending one of his schools. The investigator provided photos showing the boy in question's resemblance to Dennis. He explained that he'd found some discrepancies in the boy's records that made him suspicious of the child's identity. He also claimed that the child had once responded when someone called him Dennis. FBI agents met with the investigator and the boy, but determined he wasn't Dennis based on some key physical details. Dennis had a large strawberry-colored birthmark on the back of his head and a mole that looked like a drip of coffee on his foot. The boy in Portland didn't have either mark. Though he wasn't Dennis Martin, there is some vague reference to the child possibly being related to a family that were known to be running from law enforcement at the time. One of the last but more interesting leads came from Sheriff Sutton. An inmate had provided information on a man he was once incarcerated with who claimed to have kidnapped Dennis and sold him. Sheriff Sutton and the FBI both agreed that the details the inmate knew were suspiciously accurate. His story was considered detailed enough to warrant follow-up. A preliminary investigation began into the suspect, including dates of his incarceration and possible associates. One of these associates was contacted and told agents that he also knew the informant and considered him a compulsive liar. He said the suspect was known to tell stories about his past exploits, but that he'd never heard anything about him kidnapping anyone. Agents then tracked the suspect down to a correctional facility and interviewed him. He confirmed he already knew about the informant's claims and said the man had been telling other people they were incarcerated with too. According to the suspect, he and the inmate were once friendly, but their relationship dissolved during their time together at the other facility. The suspect believed that the informant's reason for making up the story was just to cause trouble. As he explained to the agents, people who were accused of doing something to harm a child weren't looked at positively by other inmates. He told the agents he had never been to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and that the closest he'd ever come to it was in 1976 when he was traveling with his wife. The suspect also gave the agents information on his whereabouts prior to 1976, claiming he had been incarcerated most of his life since he was a juvenile. The suspect is never mentioned again in the FBI's files or in any other reports on Dennis's case. It appears the FBI had reason to believe his story, and he's been cleared. It's been half-heartedly suggested that maybe Dennis was kidnapped, but he wasn't the abductor's real target. Instead, for unknown reasons, the abductor was after one of Carter Martin's sons, but took the wrong child. Keep in mind this is just a result of the public becoming too involved in the case and the rumor mill churning as it always does. There's absolutely no evidence to back it up. In a place with so much peaceful wilderness, the presence of animals who have made their homes in the area is a given. There are many wild creatures in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, including potentially dangerous black bears, wild boars, and venomous snakes. The possibility that Dennis could have been attacked and killed by one of these animals has been considered as a theory. These animals can all be lethal to humans, but their willingness to do so is highly questionable. Black bears aren't known to be particularly aggressive. In cases where they have attacked people, it's very frequently due to the victim coming too close to the bear's cubs, food, or personal space. Wild boars are similar in that regard. They usually prefer to avoid humans altogether. If an animal did attack Dennis, it can be easily assumed it wouldn't have been silent and clean. There should have been witnesses who heard or saw something unusual. If nothing else, search personnel should have found traces of an attack happening. A snake bite is somewhat more likely than an attack by a larger animal. However, if a fatal bite were received, it could have taken days for Dennis to succumb to the snake's venom. Assuming he were bitten near his last known location, we can expect that he would have informed the adults right away. The most likely scenario would appear to be that Dennis got bitten by the snake and either panicked or was already off track, leading him to get lost. The bite itself would not necessarily have been the thing that ended Dennis's life. It's not impossible by any means, and it ties in well with the most accepted theory of what happened to Dennis. The opinion of the FBI and the National Park Service has always been that Dennis's disappearance is the result of him becoming lost and disoriented. They believe Dennis wasn't able to survive out in the elements unprotected and without supplies, and that his remains are still somewhere in the park. This theory seems to be a logical answer as to why Dennis vanished. Taking it as truth, we can assume that somewhere between the place he was last seen and the boys' meeting spot, Dennis got confused about where he was going. He may not have even realized he wasn't headed in the right direction until he'd been walking for a while. By the time he noticed something was wrong, he might have attempted to correct himself and actually become more lost instead. Maybe he knew how lost he'd become and thought if he kept going, he'd eventually find help to get back. The night Dennis disappeared, there was heavy rain and temperatures in the 50s. These conditions created a risk of hypothermia for anyone without proper clothing and shelter. Dennis could have become uncomfortable in the rain and cold, leading him to seek shelter in an out-of-the-way place. If his body remained there, searchers might not have seen him in the following days. The rain created slippery terrain and lowered visibility significantly. There would have been a serious fall risk in those conditions. In the case Dennis did make it past that first night, he still wasn't safe from harm in the park alone. He would have faced starvation, fatigue, and dehydration that could lead to death within a few days. The effects of fatigue and not having anything to fuel his body would have left him exhausted and potentially combating dizziness and headaches. He eventually would have become dangerously disoriented and uncoordinated. This is a situation that would have been bad for an adult experienced with wilderness survival. For a 6-year-old boy, it would have been life-threatening. The main problem with this theory is the lack of remains. It's frequently asked why, if Dennis did die of exposure in the park, no one has ever located any trace of him. To find the possible answer to that question, we have to look more closely at what occurred after he went missing. Great Smoky Mountains National Park encompasses 522,427 acres of vast, rugged wilderness. Many of those acres consist of dense forest and thick underbrush. The area surrounding Spence Field, where Dennis was last seen, was covered with rhododendron thickets. In 1969, search technology was limited, and the thick forest canopy in the park would impair basic aerial searches. Most of the work of finding a missing person had to be done on foot. It would have been nearly impossible for search personnel to cover every inch of ground where a missing person might have gone. The mountainous nature of the park's terrain further complicated things. There are crevices, sinkholes, ridgetops, and more that would have been unlikely places to find Dennis, but not places he definitely couldn't have gotten to. There are areas in the park that contain spots so well hidden that if Dennis had fallen and landed there, he may have been missed by searchers just feet away. In a June 1970 issue of the Bristol Herald-Courier, Assistant Chief Ranger Ed Widemer discusses a plane crash in the park. He tells the reporter that the plane was known to be in the park but wasn't located until over a year after the crash. It's a testament to just how large and wild the park is. If it could hide a plane, the chances of finding a small boy there are low. The weather around the time Dennis went missing created multiple problems with the search environment. The thunderstorm that hit the park the night of the 14th generated about 2.5 inches of rain. It put the search off until the next morning and may have washed away important evidence by then. The streams in the park continued to rise and made it hard to hear anything over the sound of rushing water. The rain would continue to fall intermittently for days after Dennis disappeared. The dirt became a mess of deep mud in frequently traveled places, and it was much easier for searchers to lose their footing and fall on the wet ground. The use of tracking techniques was made futile. Dogs trained for that purpose led their handlers nowhere. As hundreds of people walked around the search area, footprints became indistinguishable from one another. The amount of people participating in the search resulted in other complications too. It would seem that the more people who were searching for someone, the better. But that's only true to a certain extent. Dennis's disappearance became a media circus quickly once news of it got out. As the public became invested in the little boy being found, more and more people arrived at the park to offer help. These public volunteers added numbers to the existing search personnel that had been requested by the National Park Service. There were multiple search and rescue teams, members of the military, and people who worked for the park, among others, who all had some level of wilderness or rescue experience. The public volunteers were a toss-up. While some of them did have experience, many of them were extremely unprepared and undertrained to partake in a search of this magnitude. It wasn't just those volunteers who were out of their depth, though. The National Park Service wasn't much better off. There was no precedent set for this kind of search, and officials didn't have any kind of written plan. If the searcher wasn't part of one of the groups trained for this sort of activity, there wasn't anything set in stone for them to follow. It's within reason to think there could have been clues to where Dennis went that were either ignored and thought to be unrelated, or never noticed at all. A lot of areas were repeatedly searched, but something that was there one day could easily have been gone the next. We'll never know if Dennis would have been found in a less complicated, more organized search, but there's no doubt efforts were hindered. The impact of the various factors that hampered the search was so significant that they influenced search and rescue planning across the country. Dennis's case is used in search and rescue training as a study on what not to do. There have been manuals created for best search practices that tell search personnel what tactics are the most effective and how they should be performed. The goal is for a search like the one for Dennis to never happen again. As for the passage of time, it's now less likely than ever Dennis's remains will be located. The landscape of the park has changed since 1969. Some places that were once clear and easy to walk through have become covered in brush. If Dennis was missed by searchers who were close to him at one time, we might now have that much less accessibility to him. The ground in the park gains about an inch of soil every year due to the decomposition of fallen leaves, burying anything that's been left on the forest floor. The number of animals inhabiting the park who could have scattered remains is abundant. The likelihood of someone stumbling upon Dennis has diminished greatly. Even a new search using improved techniques and technology couldn't ensure anything new would be uncovered. Sadly, there's a good chance we'll never truly know what happened to Dennis or where he ultimately ended up. There's been little new information in the decades since 1969. In January of 1980, a tip was called into the FBI about a man claiming to know where Dennis was. The investigation into this lead was short and met a dead end. The man who'd provided the information told agents he didn't know anything. He claimed it was actually a neighbor who had said Dennis was living in Georgia with some of his relatives. When agents contacted this neighbor, he acted as though the conversation had never happened. He said he'd never even heard of Dennis, and that he didn't know anything like that about anyone else either. It's undetermined which of the men was the true originator of the information, but it appears to be unfounded regardless. Dwight McCarter was a park ranger working for Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1969. He actively participated in the search for Dennis. During an interview in 2009, he told a reporter for the Knoxville News-Sentinel that he was once informed that there were undiscovered remains in the park. McCarter said that in 1985, an acquaintance admitted to having found what appeared to be a child's bones in Tremont's Big Hollow. The man provided a location that was about 3 miles downhill from Dennis's last known location. McCarter noted that this location was also in the same direction the footprints found during the search were going. The man who found the remains had chosen not to report them because he'd been illegally picking ginseng at the time. McCarter gathered 30 volunteers and went to the location, but nothing of interest was found there. He thinks that because of the amount of time that passed between when the bones were found and when he came looking for them, scavenger animals had scattered them. No date is provided for when the man came across the remains, but it seems to have happened sometime after the end of the search for Dennis and prior to 1985. There's no way to prove the man's story was true, but McCarter's willingness to believe him does hold some weight in my opinion. Dennis Martin would have turned 52 in 2024. He would probably be a father himself, maybe even a grandfather today. He might have chosen to carry on the tradition of spending Father's Day weekend camping in the mountains with the people he loved the most. That weekend just before he turned 7 would simply be another happy memory in a sea of ones just like it. Dwight McCarter has said that for years after Dennis went missing, members of the Martin family could still be found looking for him in the park. In 2014, William Martin passed away of natural causes. He never gave up on finding his missing son. Thank you for watching.